بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. Inshallah, how was lunch? Good? Don't fall asleep on me, man. If it was too good, then that's a problem. So, we're talking today about conduct in the workplace and the realities that we have to deal with in the workplace, and trying to make sure that we serve in every aspect of our life in the best way possible, in a way that's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as much as we possibly can. And of course, that brings with it certain challenges in spaces that are not fully under our control, so to speak. Meaning in an environment where there may be things that we have to deal with, matters that sometimes can be very polar opposites of the reality that we want to be in, but we have to be in a place because we have to make a living that we're exposed to certain things that become a challenge for us. So we're going to talk about navigating some of those things today, inshallah ta'ala. First of all, just so I understand who's here, how many of you all work full-time? Okay. How many of you all work part-time? How many of you work more than one job? Anwar, you? And how many of you are full-time mothers? How many of you are full-time mothers and work full-time jobs? Allahu Akbar. You guys give it up for them. Give it up for them. MashaAllah. That is something, right? That reality and having to live and be on fully, mentally, physically, emotionally at home, and then the same at work. That's a real, subhanAllah, those are real heroes. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of our mothers and preserve them and help us to be as good as we possibly can to them. Okay, so my conduct in the workplace. Just to start the discussion a little bit by briefly talking about the importance of work in Islam. I mean, it goes without saying. It goes without saying, but I wanted to just bring from a different angle. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. O you who believe, when the adhan for Salatul Jum'ah is called, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, go quickly to the remembrance of Allah and leave your work, leave whatever it is that you're engaged in that relates to your work, and that is better for you. And then proceed to the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, leave trade. That is better for you if you only knew. فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَابْتَغُوا مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. And then when prayer has been concluded, disperse within the land and go back to work, right? Go seek from the bounty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written from you, that rizq that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written for us before we were already born. We do have to make the effort to go and get it and remember Allah often so that you may succeed. So the reason I brought this particular ayah in this particular context is because Salatul Jum'ah is the most important weekly ritual, weekly practice that we can potentially that we engage in as Muslims. That is a time when we leave everything by the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to go sit and listen to the khutbah and to be reminded of Allah. Even in that context, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, after it's done, you're done and move on and go back to work, right? Go back to taking care of your daily affairs and those responsibilities that you are responsible for, to provide for your family and so on and so forth. So even in the context of our most important act of worship that we do on a weekly basis, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us about the importance of our other responsibilities, primarily here, and of course, particularly here in America, perhaps more so than in other places or in any country where Jum'ah is not a holiday, right? Where it's not a day where we're off. We actually have to work that day, so we go back to work, right? You don't go back home and relax for the rest of the day. So work, and like I said, it goes without saying, the status of it, the fact that we have to take care of our families, that men are the providers for their families and responsible for engaging in that space. So that is a given of life. As it relates to how we are to conduct ourselves at work, or when we do anything in this life for that matter, the Prophet ﷺ, he gave us a very high standard. Right? He gave us a very high standard, and he told us in the hadith that you're all familiar with, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ إِذَا عَمِلَ أَحَدَكُمْ عَمَلًا أَنْ يُتْقِنَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He loves that when you do something, that you do it with itqan, with ihsan. You do it to the absolute best of your ability. You do it with excellence. You try to do it, and you do it better than you can, and try to do it in its ultimately best fashion. So this is kind of the general framework that we look at when we talk about how do we approach engaging in any kind of work. And then if you talk about engaging in that work, which is ultimately becomes your means for survival in terms of your financial needs, then that should even be approached with even more so of that level of consciousness, right? When you do it, you want to do it well, right? You want to do it well for pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, and then of course the obvious benefits that come as a result of that, working in any particular field and doing what you do. By the way, as it relates to work, I'm just curious, this will also help me kind of see how to frame this discussion a little bit. Who works here in the field of business? Raise your hand. In the field of medicine? In the field of law? Engineering? Anwar is looking around. He's looking for when I say the high-paying professions, looking for the dollar signs. Who works in the field of human services? Okay, and other service industries. All right, and who works in the field of the arts? All right, okay, mashallah, like a kind of a vast array of jobs that people here work. So we're going to try to talk about things not related to particular professions, but related to general principles that we want to understand, and we want to try to reach this high bar that our Deen calls us to strive for, that apply to all fields, all industries, all different sorts of employment that people engage in. We talk often in Islam about how ibadah is not just related specifically to pure acts of worship that we engage in. For example, Salah or Sawm or Hajj and so on. These are acts of worship that we do purely seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure. But we also know that anything that we do in life can also be considered ibadah, right? And this is the reason why we're here on this earth. As Allah says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I only created human beings and jinn for the purpose of worshiping me. What does worship mean? Worship can have this very broad definition and relate to every aspect of our life. How do we ensure that our work is worship? Right? Because ultimately, if you're spending 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, I met this brother the other day, he's like, man, tomorrow I got to work 20 hours. Well, if you're working 20 hours out of your day, I don't know how you do that. Some people do, subhanAllah. How do you ensure that that's going to go into your account? Not only the money that you make from that job is going to go into your worldly account, but that also what you do is going to go into your otherworldly account, right? So some of the scholars, they put down some particular parameters to kind of help us strive to ensure that our work can be counted as ibadah. And so number one, they talk about how the work that you engage in, the type of employment that you do, is Sharia compliant. Meaning you work in an industry where you're making a halal living. That wouldn't apply, for example, somebody who owns a liquor store and his primary earnings are from that, or somebody who owns a bar or some other sort of thing that is out of the means of what we are allowed to engage in as Muslims. So number one, that the type of industry you're engaged in, and this can be an issue for some people. Lines get a little bit blurry when it comes to some professions. And some not only the profession as a whole, but particular sorts of jobs within a profession. So for example, the industry of finance, which deals heavily with riba. There are some lines that get a little bit gray there, and then those people need to ensure that what they are engaging is, their job in particular is something that is an appropriate job for them to hold as a Muslim, because you want your work to count as ibadah. You want your income to be halal. Secondly, that as we do with anything, we have to have a proper intention. Right? We have to have a proper intention as to why we're doing this. And I put here a righteous intention. Because if your intention is, I'm going to work to provide for my family because that is my responsibility as a husband, that is a righteous intention. That is an acceptable, appropriate intention for a Muslim. Right? If you're going to work because, and you're a young man saving up to have enough money so as to get married, that is an honorable intention, inshallah, you're rewarded for that. If you are a single mother and you have to work because there's nobody else to provide your family, and you're the one taking care of all their needs, then of course that's a righteous intention. So the intention has to be good. And then thirdly, that you do your work with excellence. In other words, you approach it in a way where you are you're striving to reach that bar that the Prophet ﷺ, he placed for us. That Allah says, that the Prophet ﷺ says, Allah loves when somebody does something that they do it with ihsan. So if you want your work you want to be ensured that your work is counted as ibadah, then you do it with your full body and soul. Right? Not dragging your feet, not I'm doing this because I have to, and you give it its bare minimum. Right? Every morning getting to work is such a trial. You're supposed to be in at 8 o'clock, but you barely get there by 9 o'clock. Right? Then you're not giving it that level of ihsan that our Prophet ﷺ, he told us we need to engage in for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with that particular action that we're doing. And then next, that we of course we don't engage in any acts in our workspace that are contrary to our values as Muslims. So we go to work and we work. We don't work on other stuff at work, right? I know there's a lot of people who put a lot of time in putting this MAS convention together. And I know it can be challenging at work sometimes when you have other projects going on in the community. you're involved in da'wah, and you're involved in Islamic activities. But that Islamic activity is reserved for your time outside of the time that you give to your work, right? So it's really important that we don't mix. We don't cheat our employer out of our time that is due to them, not due to somebody else. And so that's, so it's important that we expand the meaning of what that means, that we don't, when we say we don't want to wrong or cheat others. And then, of course, we're not trying to excel or promote ourselves or, push forward in our workspaces by doing things that are going to compromise or are going to be, negatively impactful on our coworkers. In other words, stepping on their toes so that we can, move forward or move higher in rank. And then the last thing is, of course, that we can't be neglectful of those responsibilities that we have as it relates to our deen. So I know people in the community, unfortunately, and that over the course of time that come across and they say, well, Sheikh, how do I do my prayers, like at the end of the day? It's time for Isha, I'm at the masjid. Should I pray Isha and then I should pray Dhuhr, Asr, and Maghrib? And I look at and say, what do you mean? Well, so every day I come home from work, and since I can't pray at work, then I come home and I pray all of my prayers at home, qada. And I say, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't matter where you are, Salah is a responsibility. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made Salah something that is restricted by time upon you. The ayah is skipping me. Somebody help me. Inna salata kanat ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta, right? That Salah is something that is written upon you at prescribed times. It's not by our choice. Well, I was busy, I was engaged in this, I was engaged in that. There are certain very finite exceptions, but the absolute vast general rule is that it's due upon everybody at its prescribed times. So that we have to make sure we are taking care of our responsibilities while we are at work, whether that be Salah. In Ramadan, that's going to also entail fasting. There may be times when people feel, are in a tight spot because, I don't know, there's a company luncheon or whatever it may be, but those are responsibilities that we have to navigate. We'll talk a little bit about how do we do some of those things. As we said, work, if you do it according to its conditions, then it has the potential to become worship. And not only that, our Prophet ﷺ, he told us in this hadith that there was a man who passed by the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sahaba, they saw him and they were amazed by how, in one riwayah it says that he was moving really fast, like he was running towards doing his work, or that it says in this riwayah that he was striving really hard. He was exerting himself in a way that was, showing how much he was attached to his work. And the Sahaba, they were marked. They said, Ya Rasulullah, law kana hadha fi sabilillah. They said, if this man, look at what he's giving to his work, his dunyawi responsibility. If he gave that to the deen, if he gave that in the path of Allah, what an amazing person he would be, what an amazing believer, what a contribution that would be. The Prophet ﷺ, as he always did, he put everything in its right place. He corrected the understanding and fine-tuned the understanding of the Sahaba, and he says to them, إن كان خرج يسعى على ولده صغارا فهو في سبيل الله, right? If he went out and is striving to take care of his young dependents at home, he's striving to take care of his children, then he is in the path of Allah. وَإِن كَانَ خَرَجَ يَسْعَى عَلَى أَبَوَيْنِ شَيْخَيْنِ كَبِيرَيْنِ فَهُوَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And if he's striving and he has his parents that he's responsible for taking care of, then he's in the path of Allah. And by the way, there's many people right now, and some of you are in the audience, I can tell who you are by looking at how gray your beards are, right? That you're in what is called a sandwich generation. You have children that you're responsible for, teenagers, maybe even kids in college, but then you also have your parents that you're responsible for. You're sandwiched in between, and that's a lot of responsibility. You know, a lot of these issues that have been talked about over this couple of days relating to in-laws and families, and those things become more complex when you have all of this pressure upon you. But the Prophet ﷺ, he tells us, and some people, they may fall in both categories, that you're striving in both categories. وَإِن كَانَ خَرَجَ يَسْعَى عَلَى نَفْسِهِ يَعِفُهَا فَهُوَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And if somebody is striving and he's trying to, he's trying to take care of his chastity, he's trying to get ready for marriage, he's making his life ready for the rest of his life, he's preparing the road for the rest of his life, then he is also in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a bachelor who's trying to, make it happen. And then he says the last category, وَإِن كَانَ خَرَجَ يَسْعَى رِيَاءً وَمُفَاخَرَةً فَهُوَ فِي سَبِيلِ الشَّيْطَانِ. And this is, of course, the dangerous category. He says if a person is going out to work, showing off for bragging rights or whatever, then that person is in the path of shaitan. But what we take from this is that we work for the purpose of trying to ensure that our work will be worship, but it can be even more than worship, it can be jihad. Right? It's a form of jihad, as our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says. And some people, subhanAllah, there was a brother, when we came into the airport, whenever it was, 2 days ago, a brother picked us up from the airport. The brother happened to be from Somalia, and got to talking to him in the car, and how long you been in this country? He says 17 years. How do you have children? Yes, alhamdulillah. And he says, but they've never lived here. He said, wow. He says they live in Somalia with their mother. And one of them is Hafid, the other two are going and they're getting their Islamic education. And he was really proud talking about them, mashallah. And then I asked him this question because I was kind of curious. I says, are you also married over here? And he said, no. And I said, mashallah, may Allah bless you, brother. That the fact that there's people in this world who are striving so hard to ensure to take care of their family and ensure that their family is going to have the best possible life situation, and that they're concerned about preserving their deen, that is indeed, if that's not jihad, then what is, right? To live apart from your family for years upon end, just so you can make sure that they're being taken care of in the best possible way. And so, subhanAllah, there's people who really who live lives of great virtuosity, trying to do what's right. And then, we talk about ethics as it relates to work. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, just briefly hint at it. But of course, as Muslims, we have to be extremely ethical. We have to be of the highest moral character in all aspects of our life. Our Prophet ﷺ, he's sent for that purpose ultimately. إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, I've been sent for the purpose, I've only been sent, إِنَّمَا, for the purpose of perfecting good moral character. And so we try to embody that great moral character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he told us in the hadith that التاجر الصدوق الأمين مع النبيين والصديقين والشهداء. That the trustworthy and truthful businessman will be with the prophets, the siddiqeen, and the martyrs. So a high status, right? The Prophet ﷺ shows the importance of not only working, everybody needs to work, but the way in which you conduct yourself at work, right? The mannerism, the way in which you carry yourself. The Prophet ﷺ, he praised those people and said that they will have a great rank. And you notice in this hadith, these are the two qualities the Prophet ﷺ was known for before Islam. Right? He was called the what? Sadiq al-Amin. He's called the one that was a Sadiq fi aqwalihi wal Amin fi af'alihi. He's truthful in his actions and he's trustworthy in his words. And that's why, there were many who believed in him just for that simple fact. So that can have a great impact upon others around you as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that, insha'Allah ta'ala. So now to talk about some kind of practical realities as it relates to work. Now to talk about some practical realities in terms of setting up boundaries and communication and so forth. There's a lot of things that we have to, be conscious of as Muslims in the workspace. And we do have to be conscious of the fact that we live in a time, in a place, and an environment where Islam is seen in a certain light, Muslims are seen in a certain light, and we should be conscious of that in general. When we go into our workspaces, we should also be very conscious of how that plays on the minds of other people when we relate with them, when we deal with them. And then we also have to be very conscious of having specific boundaries for ourselves when we deal with others, because we know that some of the values that we have may not be shared with by our coworkers. So number one, knowing our values. This can be very broad. You fill in that blank as to what that means for you. But knowing your values, meaning when you go to work, you're conscious that I'm a Muslim, I'm responsible for how I carry myself, I'm supposed to be a good example. I am responsible for I'm responsible for praying at the particular times that are prescribed for me. And so all of these different things. And by the way, when you hold true to your values, right, and this is a general rule, when you yourself respect your own values, then and only then will others respect you, right? And this is across the board in all areas of life, not only in the workplace. But if you respect yourself, by respecting who you are as a Muslim, respecting the values and the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed upon our shoulders, and you internalize that, and then you externalize that in your actions, then people will respect you. But if you don't, then people won't. And they'll say, that's a Muslim, but yeah, you know what, he or she doesn't really, I know, isn't he supposed to pray? Isn't he supposed to be fasting? Isn't he not supposed to be using that kind of language? Man, I'm surprised that person talks like the rest of us, but they don't look like whatever it may be. But it's important that you respect and that you know your own values, and you carry that. Communication is key. Communication is key. We'll talk a little bit as it relates to a couple of things in a few minutes, but generally speaking, communication as it relates to your workspace, if you go into a new job, for example, you have to be, these are some lines that you have to navigate. Do you tell your employer before you start your employment, I'm a Muslim and I have to pray 5 times a day and all of that? I don't necessarily advocate that you have to do that in all cases. You want to be careful, you want to be smart in terms of how you navigate. There are times when you tell people these things before you get the job because you're worried there may be certain places where you're going to be asked to compromise on things. But there are other times when you secure that job and then you communicate to your employer that this is my responsibility, and I'm gonna need about a few minutes, at these different times of the day to make my salah, right? And I'm gonna need a little space by which to be able to do that. As a Muslim, I understand that this is a really busy time of the year, but this is this is an important holiday for me coming up, and I'm gonna need this day off, right? So it's very important to communicate very clearly our needs to those we work with. And subhanAllah, when that communication is done on a large scale, on wide scale, what happens when Muslims are true to their deen? The organizations or even the city as a whole will make those accommodations whole scale because they understand there's many people with that. But if we as Muslims are just quiet, and passive and timid about who we are, then those things won't change. I used to work for the Los Angeles Unified School District for many years, and whenever it would come to Jewish holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? These, by the way, Ra's Sana, Yom Kabir, these are very similar. That's what those words mean in their language for them. The school district, it would shut down. They would give like a teacher preparedness day or whatever those things are called, because there were so many Jewish teachers that would be off. And they had to make it work to accommodate. And we'll talk a little bit more about holidays. I don't want to jump ahead. But the point is we have to communicate clearly. We have to be also conscious in terms of making certain strategic relationships. And I don't say this in a way of, the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Mu'min fatinun kayyis. The believer is clever and smart in terms of how they go about their affairs. When I worked at the school district, one of the guys who trained me in the beginning, he said to me, look, three people you have to get to be really good friends with, right? He says, number one, the secretary, number two, the janitor, and number three, the principal, right? And he says the secretary, because they're the front door. When you need to leave and you have business to take care of, they're gonna facilitate that for you. And I'm not saying to do things in an unethical way or something like that, but there are times when you have to take care of business sometimes. The janitor, because they're gonna give you access to where you need to go to. And subhanAllah, it was good advice. He used to open up the auditorium so I could go pray and so on and so forth. And the principal, you need to be on good terms because that's your boss ultimately, right? So we need to also be smart. It doesn't mean we need to be, we need to be in our workspace and, stand on top of the desk and say, I am a practicing Muslim, all of you people listen to me, right? That's not, but there are certain people who do need to know that. There are certain people who do need to know that. Right? That may mean our boss, because there are certain things that we're going to potentially need or require. So we just need to be smart. The point is you figure out how that works for your context. When it comes to setting up boundaries, and I didn't talk much about boundaries, but boundaries meaning we are going to communicate to our coworkers, our supervisor, whoever it may be. I pray at such and such time of the day. I'd like to just have my space. I appreciate to not be, for example, touched or hugged. I used to working in the school district. You work the whole year, you come back for the summer, and everybody's greeting each other and all of this stuff, right? So that means there, again, communication comes in very important. We'll come to that in a minute. But what happens when those boundaries are violated? Again, we have to communicate, and we should communicate on the front end of things. If somebody does something that's either offensive to us because of who we are as Muslims, or they may have done something out of pure ignorance they didn't know, or something else on that line, We have for example, if you have a male or female, if you're a male and you have a female co-worker that's excessively, touches on you, or some people are just touchy-feely, that's their nature, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's just their nature. And actually, oftentimes those are, very like kind and friend and polite people, but it's important that we communicate with them, up front, and let them know, like, I prefer to, I respect I respect others from the opposite gender, and I prefer not to engage in physical contact, but that's only as a matter of respect, and so on and so forth. So it's important that we communicate those things when those things don't happen. And then set boundaries at home. Also, this is outside of work, but it's connected to work. Many, if not most people today, take their work home. Right? Some people have to, right? But some people don't have to, and yet they still do. And even if you do have to, you set it up in a way at home where it's going to not, it's not going to be a burden upon your family. You need to give 100% of yourself at home when you're at home. So for example, I have work that I have to take home sometimes, but I do it in my particular space, right? So that way, my family, my wife knows, like, okay, he's doing some things that he needs to take care of, but I'm not doing it all the time. So it's important that we set those sort of boundaries as well. And then, also, so the general point that we need to understand here, set boundaries so that you have something to stand by. If you don't have boundaries, everything's open. And then also be very open about your communication. I want to talk about a few things as it relates to specific work challenges. Yeah, I'll go about it. Yeah, that's perfect. So a few things in particular, common issues, common challenges in the workspace, right? Number one, gender interactions. I just made a reference to this a minute ago. Again, make your boundaries very clear, right? I don't hug women, and that is not something that, and this is a conversation I'm having with somebody in one of my workspaces, and that's not something that, is because of anything, but that's how my faith prescribes that I treat people of the opposite gender. And by the way, after all that's taken place in the last couple or few years as it relates to the Me Too movement, these are boundaries that are now being implemented in workspaces anyways. They're coming to these conclusions because they're realizing when there aren't boundaries, then boundaries are crossed, and that's infringing on people's, and then people don't know how to set boundaries for themselves, and they overstep. And that's where things like sexual harassment and other things come in place, right? So subhanAllah, we should never be apologetic how we approach these things. These are things that are already these are things that are in this day and age are being implemented in various professional settings. So make your boundaries very clear. Communicate, don't assume. Don't assume that other people know about you. How would they know about, you and I, unless we explain to them what our values and what our boundaries are as it relates specifically to gender interactions. Of course, it goes without saying that there's no khalwa, that there is no space for a man and woman being alone in a space where no one else has access to that space. The Prophet ﷺ says that when a man and a woman are alone and they're not related with each other, mahram, then the third party is shaitan. So we are trying to stay as far away from that as possible. And even in spaces where sometimes people think that that's not possible. So for example, I do counseling, and sometimes it's with women. And of course, it's all private and confidential and so on and so forth. But even in that space, we ensure that it's going to be done in a way where it's not completely where there's a window in the door, right? There's access for anybody to come in at any time, etc., etc. Of course, it goes without saying, lower your gaze applies to everywhere. I live in California, so for some reason people think that, in every season you can take off your clothes in California. Um, and they do that in the workspaces in places where there's very casual sort of, and that's just, it's real. I mean, even when there are policies written up, and I've worked in organizations where there's policies, but yet policies are not really worked and enforced and so on and so forth. So that's something we need to be conscious of. If we feel ourselves attracted to someone, especially in that case, then that's even more time, those are even more scenarios, more so, where we need to be on full alert and guard and so on and so forth. What about the issue of shaking hands? Very briefly, it is only in the society that we live in, and also now even in many Muslim societies, unfortunately, this kind of Western adaptation has been been adopted in other parts of the world. Men and women, the general rule is that men and women, we don't interact with physical touch. However, as you all know, when it comes to professional interactions, when you go to an interview, when you go to meet somebody for the first time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, shaking hands is a customary norm, right? So how do we navigate that? Sheikh al-Qaradawi, he has a fatwa on this particular issue where he helped, for me at least, make a very strong case for where there can be an exception made for this particular reality, so as to not fall into other more difficult situations. So in other words, I have no problem when a woman comes at me like this and I go like this, right? And they know very distinctly what that means. And all of you have faced that on many levels. And so I have no problem taking by that rukhsa, but taking by that exception. And he lays out a strong case for that. You can refer to his fatwa. And one of the things one condition he does put on it though, is that if you can, as much as possible, let the other party be the one to initiate that handshake, right? If I'm as a man, I'm not going to put out my hand, but if they initiate, then let it be. And some people are conscious of Muslim gender boundaries, so they're not going to start. So why would you initiate? As it relates to alcohol, the questionnaire that was there in the beginning that Brother Muhammad put up, alcohol and how it intersects with work is an unfortunate reality, especially when it comes to certain social gatherings that are related to work. Our Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir, fala yaq'udu ala ma'idatin tudaru alayha al-khamr." He said that whoever believes in Allah in the last day, then they should not sit upon a table where alcohol is being served. Right? In another hadith, that alcohol is being drank. So we have to be very conscious of this boundary. Right? We have to be very conscious of this boundary and ensure that we're not ready and willing to sell our deen just to be in a social space, just because there may be a potential feeling just because others may feel that we're not in that space, and then therefore, well, this person doesn't really want to be a part of us. That's where communication comes in very important, to have clear communication. You go to your supervisor, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to make the after dinner thing tonight because my faith requires that I don't engage with alcohol on any level, including in being at a table where alcohol is served. And then you say, well, even if you're not going to drink it? No, even if I'm not going to drink that. And by the way, there's a famous incident that took place with the great Khalifa Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, when there was a group of Muslims, they were caught drinking. and they were brought to the Khalifa. And somebody says to the Khalifa, and this man, he was also amongst them, and he is a righteous man, and he wasn't drinking. And Sayyidina Umar, he says, فَبِهِ إِبْدَأُ, start with him. The punishment starts with him. He shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been there in that context. And he mentioned why that is. So alcohol is not something to be taken lightly. Some Muslims unfortunately take this issue very lightly, and again, it comes to a matter of respecting yourself, right? Respect yourself and your values, and others will respect you. As soon as you let those boundaries go, the respect will also fall. I wanted to talk a little bit further about alcohol, but I didn't have the chance because of time. I'll just very quickly talk about navigating prayer. Like I said, Salah is a non-negotiable. We have to make sure that we do everything that we need to do to make sure that we have the space and the place to pray. And that needs to be communicated. If that means we need to make arrangements by talking to our supervisor for them to provide us with a room, then that's what we need to do. It is not something that we can take lightly, and we talked about that a little bit. The last thing, as it relates to holidays and holiday parties, we have our Eids, and we need to ensure that we take the day off. All fathers and mothers take the day off when you have Eid. As long as you have the ability to, meaning you have that time off or whatever it is, take the day off for Eid, make it special for your family, right? Make it special for your family. If a lot of places that I've been, they make the Salat al-Eid very early. Why? So that people can go back to work. That shouldn't be our attitude as to how we approach Eid. Eid should be given full priority because in the context in which we live in, Eid needs to be a day of great joy, and so we need to approach it that way. And as it comes to celebrating other holidays, I'll talk very briefly about the issue of Christmas, for example. I had my own personal policy that I kind of followed through my life. If there was a Christmas party, I wouldn't attend. This is my own thing. But if it was a holiday party, I said no problem. Right? And I would tell my employers that. I said, if you're going to do a Christmas party, I'm sorry I won't be able to be there because I don't celebrate Christmas. But if you're going to do a holiday party, I have no problem with that. As long as, of course, there's no alcohol and so on and so forth. So these are things that we need to be conscious of. We'll leave a few minutes for questions, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Suhail. So we had a few questions related, by the way, the shaking of the hands was asked multiple times, so I'm glad you had a chance to answer that. What about prayer? I know you mentioned that you can't be praying everything qada, but what if every day, can you pray Jama'ah of Dhuhr and Asr at work?
Every day?
Every day.
The Prophet ﷺ, he would combine Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib and Isha, and sometimes without a reason. But it was done as a way of showing the ummah that there is this, this kind of license, this sort of flexibility. But he did it in a certain way, and we should also use it in that same way, as a once in a while thing. It's not the way the Salah was structured. The Salah was structured to be throughout the day at different times. So I find it very hard pressed to find, an employment where you can't, a job where you can't find a few minutes at one point of the day. And by law, you have the breaks that are your legal right to take, right? Whatever it is, 30 minutes for every 4 hours and 15 minutes for every 2 hours. Perhaps it varies state by state. So you have that time, utilize that time, but don't make it a daily practice. Wallahu alam.
Okay. And then regarding the alcohol, a couple of questions say, sometimes you just can't get out of it, whether it's an interview, any interview you go to for medical school, sometimes grad school, sometimes you need to network, and this is part of your job, and there's always alcohol served. So how do you get around that?
Yeah. So number one, and before, the first thing I would say is that you have the ability to keep your line as tight as you want it to be, right? Sometimes people, they talk themselves into thinking that, well, I have to be there, when there's really nothing that you have to do. So if you're going, so for example, networking, it is a little bit above and beyond what you need to do. You can still network, it just doesn't have to be in that particular forum. So to find yourself those alternatives by which you can remove yourself from being in those sort of compromising realities. There may be, an exception for certain people in very tight spaces, and there may be certain job functions where it's going to be there, and then they don't have any other job opportunities. There may be some very, very minimal exceptions there, but people who have those sort of realities should seek an individual fatwa, really, to get a very precise kind of answer that would be fitting to them. But I just hesitate to talk about these things in a general sense, and to give people the impression that, well, yeah, if it's a little bit tricky and you have to navigate and you can't get out of it, well, what does that really mean? I can't get out of it, or these are events that I'm required to go to. Well, are they really those things? I think needs really a case by case situation. I would advise people who are in those scenarios to talk to people of knowledge and about your particular situation, right? Rather than to give a general rule for everyone. Wallahu alam.
Okay, and then the last question, you discussed khalwa as well. What about texting in between coworkers?
Texting between coworkers.
Like just between you and a coworker?
Yeah. I wouldn't advise I wouldn't advise texting between yourself and a coworker of the opposite gender. If that is strictly work related, I don't see an issue with that. If it's strictly work related, I mean, that's how your mode of communication, and that's the easiest way to, exchange whatever it is you need to do to get your tasks done and so on. I don't see an issue with that. It's not different than talking on the phone or anything, or talking face to face for that matter. But if it goes outside of work, then there's no need for that, and there's no room for that, actually. One shouldn't be communicating with the opposite gender in a social sense, in a looser sense, outside of workspace. Wallahu alam.
Okay, I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much, Sheikh Suhail. Thank you everybody for coming.